The Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's proceedings without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please email it to us. I now recognize myself for the purpose of an opening statement for 5 minutes. The consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to ripple through supply chains and transportation modes, including freight railroads. The supply chain situation boiled over into a full-blown crisis last year as the Biden administration sat idle and helpless to fix the problem. And this committee has closely followed the supply chain crisis and reviewed ways to address the problem and provide Americans with some much-needed relief. The full committee previously examined the impacts of COVID-19 on supply chains, including in our first hearing this Congress. The committee also held hearings on the Surface Transportation Board proposals and activities aimed at addressing rail service challenges. And in his testimony before the committee last year, Chair Martin Oberman advised that the board has the tools and authorities necessary to address rail service issues, and we look forward to tracking those initiatives. I also believe it is important to highlight how some of the current administration's policies have contributed to ongoing supply chain challenges. Vaccine mandates, which just today the White House finally sunset, excessive government transfer payments that incentivize people not to work. We hear it, people aren't going back to work. And an infrastructure law that prioritizes green projects over those that add real capacity to transportation modal networks continue to impact the supply chain. Our hearing today will examine the state of freight railroad transportation networks and ongoing supply chain challenges. As examined in previous supply chain hearings, freight rail remained comparatively resilient. However, it still encounters many challenges that are both unique to and common across all freight transportation modes. Our freight railroads are integral to our nation's economy, carrying nearly 1/3, that's right, 1/3 of the nation's freight. Freight also makes up a significant part of our international trade portfolio, carrying over 40% of freight rail cars and intermodal units, which accounts for more than 1/4 of the United States rail tonnage. Railroads are in the process of rehiring furloughed employees and are actively training new employees to expand freight capacity. Today, the subcommittee will hear from our witnesses about the current challenges to the freight rail industry in meeting supply chain goals and ongoing efforts to address these issues. And now I recognize my dear friend, Ranking Member Payne, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
And I'd like to thank the gentleman, Chairman Nels, for calling today's hearing. I'm glad that we have an opportunity to examine freight rail service and learn what can be improved. Of course, we can't neglect the importance of the freight rail workforce to the safe and reliable operation of these railroads. For the last decade, freight railroad workers have been asked to do more with less. Since 2015, the freight rail workforce has been cut by 1/3. Despite record profits, it has only been in the last year that the Class I railroads have been willing to bargain with their workforce for paid sick leave. This morning, I introduced the Freight Rail Workforce Health and Safety Act to guarantee 7 paid sick days for all freight railroad workers. Sick leave is a right. We members of Congress have paid sick leave ourselves. Our staff has paid sick leave. Executives at the railroads have paid sick leave. Freight rail workers deserve paid sick leave as well. As the workforce shrunk, trains grew in length, with some trains today reaching up to 3 miles long. These trains are too long to fit into rail yards and sidings, so they block crossings and stop people from getting to school and to work. More worrisome, these trains can stop first responders from getting to people who need them. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add the December 2022 article from the Kansas City Star into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
It shows the human toll of blocked crossings. A grandfather, Gene Bird, died while the crossing to his neighborhood was knowingly blocked by a BNSF train, and emergency responders could not get to his house in Noble, Oklahoma. In the Houston suburbs, a tiny baby died for the same reason. His mom was a nurse, and she performed CPR for 52 minutes while a Union Pacific train blocked the entrance to her neighborhood. I am pleased that our Senate counterparts advanced bipartisan rail safety legislation yesterday, which addresses both block crossings and long trains. This bill is so bipartisan, both Senator Schumer and former President Trump support it. I'm hopeful we can move similar legislation here in the House, and I look forward to working with my Republican colleagues on this. We need to improve rail safety and rail service. Last summer's rail meltdown made it clear that this industry needs resiliency. In response to service disruptions, I introduced the Freight Rail Shipping Fair Market Act, which puts shippers and the railroads on a level playing field. It requires freight rail contracts to contain service delivery standards while allowing railroads and customers to determine what those standards should be. It clarifies that common carrier service should mean efficient, timely, reliable rail service. It allows rail car owners to charge fees if railroads are slow to pick up or return their cars. The same way railroads are allowed to do the same. These ideas are supported by rail customers and rail labor. They will improve service for rail customers and for all who depend on freight railroads to bring food to the market and keep our country running. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about rail service and how the rail workforce is handling these recent challenges. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Payne. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following statements from the Private Railcar Food and Beverage Association, the Fertilizer Institute, the National Industrial Transportation League, the National Mining Association, and the Freight Rail Customer Alliance. Without objection, so ordered. It's good to see you, Mr. Larson, the ranking member of this full committee. I recognize you for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank Ranking Member Payne for holding this hearing. Today we'll hear from witnesses about how to improve rail service. But it has been more than 3 months since the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, which occurred on February 3rd, and this committee has yet to hold a hearing to examine what happened. While the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine focused the nation's attention on rail safety, it was not isolated or rare. Since that derailment, a Norfolk Southern train conductor was killed in a rail accident in Cleveland, Ohio. The town of Raymond, Minnesota had to be evacuated due to the derailment of a BNSF train carrying highly flammable material. And a BNSF derailment on the Swinmish Reservation in Skagit County in my district spilled 3,500 gallons of diesel fuel near Padilla Bay in my district. Chairman Graves and Chairman Nels, I just again urge you to hold a hearing on rail safety and to schedule consideration of rail safety legislation. Just yesterday, as we know, the Senate Commerce Committee acted on bipartisan rail safety legislation. This committee should do the same. And I commend the Department of Transportation for using its authority to issue interim safety advisories, as I urged in a letter that Ranking Member Payne led and was signed by 70 of our House colleagues. But we can and must do more. Over 400 local elected officials from across the country have sent a letter to our committee in March asking for action on rail safety. Specifically, we need to focus on long trains and the impacts they have on our communities. I've heard from leaders of more than 12 communities in Washington State, including Mayor Naring of Marysville, Mayor Boudreaux of Mount Vernon, and Deputy Mayor May of Blaine, all in my district, about how first responders have difficulty reaching individuals in need of emergency care due to long trains blocking crossings. The trends in rail safety and rail service go hand in hand. While safety has been in the forefront lately, employees and shippers have complained of fewer resources and poor rail safety for many years. The Surface Transportation Board took the extraordinary step of requiring service recovery plans from the 4 largest Class 1 railroads, Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and Norfolk Southern, to address chronic problems last year and just extended the requirement last week. The agriculture and energy sectors have been particularly hard hit with irregular rail service. This is impacting communities across the country and our overall economy. Yesterday, the STB held a hearing to determine if a tribal company in New Mexico should receive an emergency rail service order to ensure that it is able to deliver product to their customers. After years of letting rail workers go, including doubling down on furloughs during the pandemic, Class 1 railroads relied on congestion embargoes to compensate for having gutted their own workforce. The railroads issued over 1,000 congestion embargoes last year alone, and every one of those large railroads continue to use this practice, except Canadian Pacific. We can't expect more freight to move by rail in more places, which I support as part of a cleaner, greener surface transportation network, if railroads continue with congestion embargoes, which effectively tell customers to temporarily stop shipping by rail. I urge the railroads to focus on the customers, the communities they pass through, and their employees. The long-term health and resiliency of the supply chain and the economy depends on a stable and functioning freight rail system. And we've seen over and over a stable and functioning freight rail system depends on hardworking railroaders. Class 1 railroad performance on both safety and service in recent years has showed that business as usual is not working. A stark example of the dysfunction occurred last year when, after years of cutting workforce to the bone, railroads were unable to negotiate contracts with their own workers, and Congress had to step in to keep freight rail service running. Class 1s have to hire and retain more workers, return locomotives and rail yards to service, and increase training for workers, especially the new and experienced ones, so they can provide more and safer service across the country. The bipartisan infrastructure law is providing historic investments in our nation's infrastructure, and much of the material to build that infrastructure: roads, bridges, airports, transit systems, and rail. And much of that will be transported by rail. The need for rail service will continue to grow as the bipartisan infrastructure law dollars flow to states, to cities, and to counties over the next 4 years. So I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today on their suggestions to shore up our supply chain and improve rail service to move America forward. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Larson. I would like to now welcome our witnesses and thank you all for being here today. Briefly, I'll take a moment and explain the lighting system in front of you. 3 lights: green, you're good to go; yellow means you're running out of time; and red means, yeah. Ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. And as your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you, again, limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Mr. Jeffries, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today on behalf of America's freight railroads. Railroads are proud to serve the nation's economy, enabled by our dedicated employees, sustained investments, and an unwavering commitment to safety. Through economic ups and downs, our industry steadfastly works to deliver goods Americans rely on, and today we are positioned for growth. Taking stock of 2023 so far, volumes reflect economic conditions. We've seen a decrease in container traffic driven by import declines and inventory gluts. However, the intermodal system is fluid and primed for a rebound. Carload traffic is mixed. 2 examples: auto volumes are up 10% as chip shortages have eased, while chemical shipments are down 6%. Overall, carload traffic is slightly higher than it was a year ago. Service-wise, we do continue to see some improvements, but more progress is necessary to get predictability and reliability for all customers across the network to expected levels. Working with partners to better process cargo in and out of terminals, increasing shipment transparency, and reducing dwell time will further these gains. The outlook is strong for continued improvement and future growth, which is a consistent theme across the industry. But it hinges on 4 interrelated factors. First, safety, which is an overall strength, but also a continuous opportunity for this industry. Absolutely, accidents still happen, and we understand fully the impact even one accident can have on a community. That's why we continue to work to drive accident numbers lower. To be clear, rail is by far the safest way to move goods on land, especially hazardous materials. Per carload, the hazmat accident rate is down 78% since the year 2000, and 2022 saw the lowest number of hazmat incidents in the industry's entire history. Additionally, FRA data show that the mainline accident and employee injury rates for 2022 continued an era of all-time lows. And still, railroads continue proactive action, such as installing more wayside detectors, lowering alert thresholds, and developing next-gen technologies to reduce risk in the system and drive down incidents even further. Our track record is undeniable. We invest in safety because it's the right thing to do. Because a well-maintained railroad is a safe railroad, the industry continues to spend heavily on its physical network, the nation's highest-rated infrastructure by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Capital spending as a percent of revenue was 18.4% in the past 10 years, 6 times that of the average U.S. manufacturer. In 2022, spending totaled $24 billion. That's $1 billion more than the combined investments Congress made this year in rail and multimodal programs in the IIJA and Omnibus combined. Ongoing permitting efforts in Congress would enable more efficient and effective investments, particularly to upgrade and expand the network. Next, key to all aspects of our business, but especially safety and service, is an appropriately staffed railroad comprised of our highly skilled and dedicated workforce. Railroad is demanding work, and it should be appropriately rewarded. The historical deals reached last year with employees, carrying the largest pay increase in 50 years, and provisions to address quality of life matters and schedule predictability reflect this. Post-pandemic hiring continues, with our employee base at the highest it's been in over 3 years. Building workforce resiliency is a primary theme amongst rail leaders to more easily manage economic ups and downs. Class I railroads continue to strike new leave agreements across all crafts by sticking to the fundamentals of local collective bargaining. Finally, the last leg of the chair of ensuring rail can continue to thrive as a key part of the supply chain is sensible public policy. In short, policies emanating from Congress, DOT, or the Surface Transportation Board should be true to their stated goal. Perhaps overly simplistic, policy should be designed to meet a specific and identified problem. To that end, whether tackling rail safety, supply chain, or economic regulation, the fundamentals are the same. Policies should be evidence-based and pressure-tested to ensure it is properly supported by sound data. If you can't answer what problem a policy is fixing, then it probably shouldn't be included in a piece of legislation. But if we collectively follow these guidelines, there are countless issues we can tackle together. Let's build on that, not go backwards. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. I now, Mr. Baker, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chuck Baker, and I'm president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. I represent the nation's 600 small Class 2 and 3 freight railroads, commonly known as short lines. Short lines are essentially the first and last miles of the freight rail network. We play a critical connector role in the country's freight supply chain, moving all sorts of industrial, agricultural, and energy products from factories, farms, and mines to and from the Class I railroads, where they can bring the goods to and from national and global markets. Short lines are the retail branch of a wholesale business, if you will. They are largely what used to be the unloved and unprofitable branch lines of the larger railroads. Luckily, following the partial deregulation of the Staggers Act way back in 1980, rather than abandon those lines and rip up the track, the Class I sold or leased those lines to local entrepreneurs who turned them into short lines. Typically, those lines didn't have much traffic at the time and weren't in great shape. But the small-town local folks who took over these lines were excited to make a go of it. They would focus all of their time and energy on getting just one more new customer or one more carload from an existing customer. They would bend over backwards to do anything and everything their customers needed, and they sometimes got both local and federal help to invest in their infrastructure. And it worked. They saved those lines and maintained crucial freight rail service for small town and rural America. Over time, short lines have emerged as a unique American success story. Short lines are still pretty small. The average one employs about 30 people, operates about 80 route miles, and earns about $8 million in annual revenue. But collectively, they play an important role in the supply chain. They manage a third of the freight rail network, touch a fifth of all carloads, provide excellent service to their customers, and do it while still only accounting for about 6% of the industry's total revenue. The title of the hearing today is Supply Chain Resilience and Challenges, and that's what we think about every day. Short lines are the epitome of resilience, doing more with less, hustling and scrapping to serve our customers, and bringing more freight to rail. And we certainly face challenges. When the supply chain struggles, we typically act as shock absorbers for shippers, blunting the impact of service issues for our customers. Going forward, there are a number of ways that Congress can help short lines, and therefore the supply chain, thrive. One, support the CRISI program, which short lines depend on for major infrastructure upgrades. This is a win-win for both the supply chain and for short line safety. Congress could simply increase the funding provided to CRISI or direct the FRA to focus the program more tightly on freight rail supply chain and safety. 97 members of the House, including Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, and Ranking Member Larson, actually have already signed a letter requesting FY24 appropriations funding for CRISI at the fully authorized level, so a huge thank you for that. Two, support short line disaster relief. There is currently no federal program that supports short line recovery after natural disasters, which can hamper our ability to help communities recover after those disasters. Three, avoid any efforts to increase truck size and weights, which would divert more freight to our roadways, lead to greater wear and tear on already worn-out roads, worsen highway congestion, increase air pollution, and lead to a litany of safety problems. Congress has rejected this concept repeatedly over the years, but this zombie proposal keeps reappearing, so Congress might need to reject it once more. Four, ensure that regulations allow room for innovation and progress. The inability of our Class 1 friends to get FRA approval to transition to primarily automated track inspection programs is a good example of this not working. Five, support railroad workers by supporting the REEF Act, which would remove railroad unemployment and sickness benefits from sequestration cuts. This would help with hiring and retention, which is good for the supply chain. I'm going to skip 6. 7, do no harm. With all the discussion about rail safety, it's important to only pass new regulations that are narrowly targeted to fix real problems and that won't raise railroad costs and degrade service and end up counterproductively pushing freight onto the more dangerous highways instead. And finally, 8, support the Short Line Safety Institute, which is a voluntary program funded by the FRA. Short lines are critical pieces of the supply chain, particularly for shippers in small towns and rural America. Congress's actions can help determine whether we and the small communities we serve grow and flourish or stagnate and fail. Thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Mr. John, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Payne, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee, appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Pull the mic a little closer to you, buddy.
Closer, sorry.
Thank you, sir.
Is that better?
Some of us can't hear very well up here, you know that.
All right. Is that better?
Thank you.
So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on behalf of the American Chemistry Council, our members, and the members of the Rail Shipper Coalition. I also want to thank the members of this committee for helping prevent what would have been a catastrophic strike last year, impacting all of our nation's supply chain. So I'm going to leave you with 3 key points today from my testimony. Number 1, transporting chemistry is a crucial part of the nation's supply chain. Number 2, structural and serious problems remain that undermine the utility and the effectiveness of our transportation network. And number 3, Congress can help get that system back on track. So our industry is one of the largest freight rail customers, and we're growing. We need a resilient and responsive freight rail network to support chemical manufacturing in the United States. And it's important to everyone in this country and everyone in this room because the products we make and transport by rail are essential for growing food, for producing energy, for delivering safe drinking water, and making life-saving medicines and equipment. None of that happens without chemistry. So our industry is at the headwaters of the manufacturing economy. Problems that impact our industry reverberate throughout and cascade throughout the supply chain, which ultimately impacts customers in the form of shortages and inflation. It's also, chemical manufacturing is also important to our national priorities, like energy independence, like competing with other countries in critical technologies, such as world-class semiconductors. Quite simply, if we want to make things in the United States of America, rather than in places like China, we must manufacture and move more chemicals in the United States. For For that to happen, we have to fix our nation's transportation supply chain and make it stronger than ever. Now, railroads have made some progress and recovered from some of the pandemic-related issues because of eased demand, but many rail service problems continue to negatively impact our members and thus the country. So in our most recent supply chain survey of our members, we found that while conditions improved in the second half of last year, our freight transportation problems are far from over. And in fact, nearly all of our members say that supply chain and freight transportation disruptions are impacting their manufacturing operations today. If you remember nothing else about what I say today, please remember this. More than 80% of our members report that despite recent improvements, conditions remain worse than prior to the pandemic. So we are still having significant issues shipping. And unfortunately, the situation is even bleaker when it comes to freight rail. Our survey found that 30% of our member companies said rail service problems were worse in the second half of last year, and more than 3/4 reported worse service than before the pandemic. So these are real problems with real consequences. As I detailed in my written testimony, our members continue to face a range of service challenges from delays and reductions in service days to extended service embargoes. These service problems disrupt the supply of raw materials and customer deliveries and force companies to reduce production here in the United States. They put producers at a disadvantage versus imports from China that ship from port terminals that are served by multiple railroads. The history has shown that we can't rely on the railroads to fix these problems on their own. In short, as someone has said, hope is not a strategy. Rather, policymakers need to adopt reforms that incentivize railroads to make their networks more resilient and help prevent a future crisis. For example, there have been reforms languishing at the Surface Transportation Board for 7 years, like reciprocal switching, which would help provide greater access to competitive rail service. So despite what you may hear from others on this panel, it isn't a radical idea. It's something that's been used in Canada for over 100 years. And in fact, two of North America's largest railroads continue to use it to thrive and grow. So access to competitive rail service is very important to chemical manufacturing. It's a key driver in determining where our members expand and invest. So for example, we have a member company that recently decided to invest in the Houston area and picked one congressional district over another because of the access to competitive rail service. This project created 2,500 construction jobs, 75 full-time jobs, and created an economic impact of that in that community of $100 million. So Congress can help us address these issues, support the STB, and hold railroads accountable for their poor service. So I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jan. And Mr. Scribner, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Mark Scribner. I am a Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at Reason Foundation, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan public policy research and education organization. Throughout our 45-year history, transportation innovation has been a major area of focus. My testimony focuses on the growing role and benefits of automation technologies in surface transportation generally and freight rail specifically, as well as policy barriers to the development and deployment of these technologies and the potential consequences of failing to address these barriers. After decades of excessive economic regulation nearly destroyed the railroad industry in the United States, Congress responded by enacting deregulatory measures that culminated in the Staggers Rail Act of 1980. The Staggers Act helped reverse U.S. freight rail's terminal decline and has encouraged hundreds of billions of dollars in private investment since its enactment. The gains enjoyed by customers and carriers in the decades that followed are large and unambiguous. Estimated inflation-adjusted average freight rates have declined by nearly half, while freight volume grew by more than 50%. Even though the Staggers Act concerned economic regulation, it also facilitated large safety gains. A 2016 study published in the Review of Industrial Organization found that, quote, Staggers may be responsible for most of the reduction in the accident rate from its 1978 high, unquote, and that, quote, FRA regulatory restrictions that have been adopted since the Staggers Act, however, are not associated with improved safety, unquote. Despite this impressive turnaround, near and long-term threats to freight rail's ongoing success have emerged. The COVID-19 pandemic threw supply chains into chaos, and freight rail was not spared. The pandemic's impact was multifaceted, with large shocks to both supply and demand. During the worst of the pandemic, total consumption remained on trend due in part to generous government assistance that kept personal incomes high. Consumers instead shifted their spending from services, many of which were shuttered to mitigate public health risks, to durable and non-durable goods. Coupled with capacity constraints, this large spike in goods consumption quickly overwhelmed every supply chain link. None of these problems could be resolved quickly, absent perhaps a major economic recession, which many or most would say is undesirable. Only subsiding goods demand or long-term investment in additional logistics capacity to serve these new normal demand patterns could ease congestion. However, emerging automation technologies could have improved logistics efficiency and blunted some of the negative effects experienced over the last few years. In the broader transportation automation landscape, applications for road vehicles have received the most attention. Advanced driver assistance systems such as automatic emergency braking and lane keeping assistance are available in cars marketed to consumers today. Extensive testing and limited commercial deployments of fully automated passenger and freight road vehicles have also occurred in recent years. Truck automation technologies are currently being developed by numerous companies. While achieving fully automated commercial trucking operations at scale is years away, the industry has good reason to continue these technology investments. According to the American Transportation Research Institute, truck driver wages and benefits accounted for 44% of operating costs on a per-mile basis in 2021, roughly double the cost of fuel, the next highest cost category. The potential productivity gains from reducing labor costs and increasing asset utilization would have dramatic competitive implications for the broader surface transportation market. Freight rail automation technologies to improve safety and efficiency are also being pursued. Given the potential cost savings from trucking automation, automating rail will be necessary to compete in the transportation sector of the future, particularly for higher value traffic such as intermodal, for which railroads already compete intensely with truck carriers. Regulations that would reduce development and deployment of new rail technologies needed to compete in the freight transportation marketplace would have negative consequences for shippers and consumers. But there are also social consequences worth considering. A 2011 GAO report estimated truck accidents result in 6 times as many fatalities per billion ton miles as rail and nearly 17 times as many injuries. Thus, a shift in freight traffic from rail to truck can be expected to have a negative impact on overall transportation safety. Similarly, a modal shift from rail to truck is likely to worsen environmental outcomes. According to the EPA, when compared to freight rail, trucks produce approximately 10 times as much carbon dioxide, more than three times as much fine particulate matter, and 2.5 times as much nitrogen oxides per ton mile. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Scribner. I now recognize Mr. Reagan. You have 5 minutes, my friend.
Thank you, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Payne, Chairman Graves, and Ranking Member Larson for having me today. I'm Greg Regan, President of the Transportation Trades Department at AFL-CIO. TTD is a federation of 37 unions whose members design, build, operate, and maintain America's transportation network. We proudly represent the totality of rail labor, whose members work on those front lines across the entire passenger and freight rail industry. These workers see firsthand the service, safety, and staffing challenges in freight rail, and we know the negative consequences for workers, customers, and communities when the system is not operating properly. Today, I am reminded of the last time I testified before this committee, just 2 days before the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. This derailment traumatized the community and drew national attention to safety deficiencies in the freight rail network. The East Palestine derailment is the embodiment of a fact that rail workers have warned about for years, that safety, customer service, and workforce morale at the Class 1 freight railroads have been subverted by a business model that prioritizes profits and shareholder returns above all. I want to emphasize 2 points today. First, that safety and service issues are directly connected and are the result of management decisions. Second, the only way this industry will improve is through intervention by Congress. The industry will not meaningful reform itself, and core safety and service improvements should not be left for the bargaining table. Any service industry should be responsive to the demands and needs of its consumers. Instead, the Class 1 railroads adopted an operating model known as precision scheduled railroading, which fundamentally seeks to generate the highest possible profits through the lowest possible operating ratios. A key element of this business model is stripping rail networks of their physical and human capital. Since 2015, Class 1 railroads reduced their total workforce by 30%. They slashed their private investments in physical infrastructure and sold off or sidelined essential equipment. In making these cuts, the railroads have made a choice to simply not provide adequate rail service. The actions of the Class 1s came to a head during the pandemic, when freight rail service issues marred the supply chain. Throughout the pandemic, the railroads imposed service embargoes, limiting the amount of freight a railroad accepts from a customer. The embargoes led to massive backlogs of freight, including ships and containers at the Port of LA Long Beach, and among others. The Surface Transportation Board has taken unprecedented steps in recent years to monitor and direct the Class 1 railroads to improve their service. 1 year after the STB held watershed hearings on rail service issues, the board found earlier this month that rail service had not meaningfully improved and that at least 3 of the Big 4 freight railroads failed to meet their own self-improvement benchmarks. The railroads' issues also extend to safety. Unfortunately, East Palestine was not an anomaly. The industry averages over 1,000 derailments a year. That's nearly 3 a day. Contrary to the railroad's rhetoric, the industry's safety record is getting worse, not improving. According to federal data, the accident and incident rate has actually increased over the last decade at the 4 biggest Class 1 railroads. Labor union, shippers, and the Class 1s all agree that the first step to a better freight rail service is to hire more workers, yet the railroads have made little progress in increasing their workforce numbers as well. As of March 2023, the total Class 1 employment level remained below pre-pandemic levels. It also still significantly lower than the pre-PSR high watermark. On an individual Class 1 railroad basis, only Canadian Pacific and CSX have gotten back to their pre-pandemic employment levels. It is no surprise that Class 1 railroads have struggled to retain and hire the workforce they need to meet demand. While they talk about the importance of rebuilding their workforce, they still have not resolved quality of life issues like draconian attendance policies and lack of access to leave that are driving workers out of the industry. Until they do so, employee hiring and retention rates will be insufficient and rail service will suffer. It will take action from Congress, federal regulators, and the railroads themselves to resolve the core staffing, service, and safety issues that threaten not only our country's freight rail supply chain, but our overall economy. Rail labor and shippers are united around many of the proposed solutions, which doesn't actually happen very often. Congress should further strengthen and define the existing federal common carrier obligation that rail carriers serve a shipper on a reasonable request. That reasonable request language is not defined in federal statute, making it difficult to enforce. The Surface Transportation Board has made admirable efforts to get the railroads to improve service, but they need more enforcement tools to ensure that the railroads are meeting their common carrier obligations. Rail can be the greenest and most effective way to move cargo over land, but only if we have a well-kept infrastructure and well-trained workers in place to meet the existing demands and future demands of our shipping communities and expand the market share of goods safely shipped by rail. We have a unique opportunity to get freight rail back on track by passing meaningful rail safety and service improvement legislation and harnessing the investments of the infrastructure law in concert with greater investments from the railroads themselves. It is time for everyone to act. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Riggin, and I thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to questions from the panel, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Like every mode of transportation, the pandemic took a toll on the efficiency of the freight system. Mistakes were made by government and businesses, and I think that is beyond dispute. However, having traveled extensively to some of our largest railroads, the short lines, the shippers, the manufacturing facilities, I'm happy to say that the men and women I engage with were hardworking, patriotic, and laser-focused on improving safety and efficiency. We have assembled a diverse set of experts to testify here today. They are some of the brightest in their respective fields. And it is my hope that we can educate ourselves on the problems facing the industry and discuss solutions that are proven to increase safety. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the tragic derailment that occurred in East Palestine. Everybody in the room understands that Norfolk Southern must stay as long as needed to make that community whole, and then some. From my perspective, it seems clear that our major railroads are taking safety seriously. I welcome the proactive steps undertaken by Class 1s to make additional investments in wayside hotbox detectors, standardizing alert thresholds for stopping trains and inspecting bearings, adopting new industry standards for analysis protocols, and increasing awareness about Ask Rail. Ask Rail. I don't know how many of you heard of it. We're going to hear about it today. The NTSB investigation of Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine is ongoing, and I look forward to their final report to offer more guidance and facts. Got a question, Mr. Jeffries, Mr. Baker, either one, pipe in. There has been some criticism of freight railroads' service quality and ability to accommodate shippers. The Surface Transportation Board recently extended the reporting period for Class 1 railroads to provide service metrics through December 31st of this year. So why has the service suffered? What are the freight rails doing to fix the problem? And when do you feel it can be resolved? Mr. Jeffries?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Service absolutely in certain areas of the country is not where it needs to be and not where it historically has been. Certain areas are showing demonstrable improvement, and I'm confident that'll continue to be the case. But your question is, how did we get here? How did these challenges emerge? The pandemic flipped the supply chain, the workforce, not only of the nation, but of the globe on its head. And when we saw traffic drop upwards of 30% in the depths of the pandemic, railroads employed what was a time-tested practice of about probably 100 years or more of when the traffic's not there, temporary furloughing employees and bringing them back when the traffic comes back. And historically, the return rate's been 90+%. We had a pretty dramatic snapback on consumer goods, container goods. My colleague mentioned the shift in consumer spending away from services to products. And we started calling folks back, didn't have that return rate.
Mr. Baker, what do you feel? How do you feel?
There's no question that it's been 4 or 5 years of struggling service. I do think that we can say today, I'm hearing from my short lines, that they're seeing green shoots of improvements. I certainly wouldn't dispute what Mr. John is saying, that some customers remain frustrated, but short lines, view the rail network largely from a shipper's perspective also, and I think we're seeing improvements. I have no doubt that our Class 1 friends would do the last few years differently if they could, but I think it's starting to get better.
Sure. Mr. Jeffries, can you explain in layman terms the Ask Rail? I bring up this Ask Rail, what it is, and will AAR commit to expanding the program to allow the short lines and the commuter rail to participate if they aren't already? Ask Rail.
Absolutely. So to answer the second portion of your question first, we absolutely want to include the short lines, and I believe we're in process with bringing our largest short line on board. So Ask Rail is a mobile app for first responders that allows, as a train goes by or in the unlikelihood of a derailment, a first responder can enter a car number from any car on the train. It'll give the entire consist of the train, whether there's hazmat located on the train, if there is, how to respond and who to contact. And so it is a very helpful tool for first responders to know what's in their community and how to respond and who to contact. Our biggest challenge is how do we get it out to broader folks? We've been going an individual by individual case, but we've shifted to an emergency operations center-based process to cover more ground, and certainly would love to work with anyone on this committee to spread its use.
I certainly think, I'm certainly more interested in the Ask Rail, and I hope that this committee will take some time and we should look into this app and see how this could help our first responders, because we've heard from both sides they're concerned about, when you have a derailment, can first responders respond accordingly, things of that nature. So I think that's great. And the IIJA roughly provided $500 million a year for Railroad Crossing Elimination Program, and I'm very supportive of the policy. The FRA administrator is supportive of the program. I'm interested in it. I mean, when these trains, I think Ranking Member Larson was talking about trains, covering intersections, blocking intersections. You mentioned the story. I think we should provide a lot more funding and support to try to think about how we can support this program, and it's going to require more resources than just $500 million. So I want to learn more about that program and how we can, expand to increase safety. So I will now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Larson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for accommodating my schedule. I appreciate that. I've got some other meetings I got to get to, but I'll also jump to questions. Mr. Regan, trains have been getting longer and longer, some as long as 5 miles out west, which is, in my view, anywhere west of the DC line, but I mean farther out, I'm sure. 2 weeks ago, the Federal Railroad Administration issued a safety advisory on how long trains block crossings and creating braking challenges. How do employees handle longer trains? How are rail workers told to consider the impact of block crossings when building trains?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. The long trains is increasingly a problem from our members' perspective that we've seen as these trains have doubled or tripled in size over time. If there is a problem on board a train and you have two people working there, one engineer, one conductor, to identify the problem on a 3-4 mile long train, you have to have someone walk the entire length to identify what that problem is, radio it back up, then figure out a way to deal with the issue. And currently, we do not have sidings that can accommodate most of these large trains. So if there is a problem, it is going to create a backlog on the system, and if that happens to be in the middle of a community, then they're kind of out of luck here, and they're gonna have to deal with some block crossings. And so it creates real headaches in a community, but certainly our ability as workers to deal with the problems in quicker, more effective time is much hampered by the fact that these trains are getting so long.
Thanks. Mr. John, you talked about the impact of the rail congestion embargo on shippers, but I wanted to ask you if it's feasible to ship your goods another way if rail service is unreliable from maybe just from ACC, and maybe you could speak to the broader shipper coalition on that too.
Sure, happy to do that. So in regards to what our members, how they ship and how their infrastructure is set up, so we're talking about bulk shipments of chemistry that, so for example, 4 tank cars is the same as 1 rail car. And so when you're shipping things like chlorine that provides for clean drinking water that we need all across this country, those facilities are set up specifically for rail. And so they're not easily able to switch to truck to ship those products as an alternative. That's just not structurally how both our facilities are set up as well as the facilities that receive those inbound shipments. So we're not able to pivot in a way that maybe some other products would be able to do.
Any other examples? You mentioned chlorine. Any other examples of bulk cargo that's not easily transferable?
You know, so it's, again, we're one of the very largest shippers of commodities on the rail system. So almost everything that our members make at petrochemical facilities go into the rail system. So it's everything from the products that go into electric vehicle batteries or solar panels or semiconductors, a very small piece of chemistry that goes into a semiconductor. But our members predominantly move product through the rail system.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Mr. Regan, you and others have discussed how rail safety and rail service are related. Do you have any suggestions for legislation that we should pursue that help us get a twofer on that deal?
Yes, I think the Rail Safety Act is certainly an important piece of legislation. It just moved out of the Senate Commerce Committee yesterday. But also the Surface Transportation Board reauthorization, language that I know was introduced last year and that has been discussed by this committee, would both address the economic concerns as well as the safety concerns that we're seeing on the railroads.
Okay. Mr. Jeffries, we've talked in the past about first responders, and you mentioned the program there. Does that program allow for notifying responders before the train gets to the community, or is this just one where you're looking at the train as it's going by and then checking the app?
So the app is real-time. On the notification in advance, that's something generally we've worked more through state fusion centers and state security apparatus to let them know in general these are the types of things moving through your community. But the app is real-time itself.
The app is real-time, but not. Thanks. That's good to know. I think that's good. I appreciate the time, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I will now yield 5 minutes to my great colleague out of the great state of Texas, Mr. Babin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses, all of you, for being here today and giving your testimony. I represent Texas' 36th Congressional District, which stretches basically from southeast Houston all the way over to the Louisiana border. The region's home to the largest concentration of refineries and petrochemical plants in the entire country, as well as contains the Port of Houston, which in terms of tonnage moved is the busiest port in the country. Rail is far and away the most efficient, cost-effective, and safest way to move these critical products over long distances. It is this combination, great manufacturing plus a safe and efficient movement of goods utilizing ports and rails that made Southeast Texas and the greater Houston region a national economic engine. So I want to thank all of you for your important work that you and your members represent. This question is for Mr. John. Thank you for your remarks and your presence today in this critical topic. 96% of manufactured products rely on the business of chemistry. And with a large industry presence in my district, this topic really hits home. For many of these companies in Texas 36, rail is the only cost-efficient, safe way to move these products over long distances. I would ask you if you could dive deeper and talk about a few supply chain disruptions that the industry has faced since the beginning of the pandemic and the impact on not only Texas, but on the entire U.S. economy, and how might future supply chain disruptions impact consumers across the country, and how it would impact your industry as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Congressman.
Yes, sir.
Our industry supports 25% of U.S. GDP. Again, with the manufacturing supply chain starts with us. As you said, 96% of all finished products have a component of chemistry in them. So when we're looking at things like rail service embargoes that we've had, one railroad had over 1,000 they had 5 in 2017, and they had over 1,000 last year. But it's not just the number of embargoes. They're using embargoes to manage congestion on their network. It's also looking at the impact of those embargoes. So for example, one railroad had one embargo on all the traffic going into California. The impact of that was massive. California by itself is the 5th largest economy in the world, right? And it also is home to our nation's largest ports. So that's an example of how railroads are using that embargoes, which are intended to be for crisis events like a weather event. We would argue that that's an appropriate thing to do. But they have used this to manage their congestion on the network. And I'll give you some other examples that are not in California. For example, we've got a company who is only getting about 2/3 of its shipments, or less than 2/3 of its shipments. It's competing against companies in China, bringing in product to a port that has multiple railroads that goes out from there. So that when I talk about, how important this supply chain crisis that we have is, that's what I'm talking about. It's hard for our members to compete globally against competition in China that does not, frankly, face the same transportation challenges that we have here domestically.
Absolutely. Well, my next question is for Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Baker. Late last year, the threat of a labor strike had much of the country prepared for a complete standstill. And fortunately, I should say, that crisis was averted when Congress intervened to prevent what appeared to be a total shutdown of our rail network. Chemical companies in my district were particularly concerned about a potential strike, given safety concerns unique to some of their products that are moved via rail. Can you explain the impact of a rail labor strike that it would have had on our supply chain, and are there any suggestions for avoiding that situation in the future and a repeat of it? Thank you.
Well, certainly it would have been a devastating impact to the economy, and one that I think, frankly, we may, as evidence today, we may not see eye to eye on every issue. Certainly, it was one where most of our customer groups were fully aligned with the need to ensure that there was no work stoppage, and certainly appreciate the hard work of not only the administration, the Congress, and the 12 labor unions, the majority of which we got voluntary agreements with, 9 out of 13 contracts. Majority of employees voted yes. We fell short on a few, and fortunately, Congress chose to follow the pattern and avoid that.
Thank you. Mr. Baker?
Appreciate the question. Short lines are typically not part of the national labor bargaining, but I think it's probably the understatement of the year to say that a national rail strike would be completely catastrophic to the economy. I think Congress did the country a great service by stepping in. And you did also ask a question about what can be done going forward to avoid it. And I think, sort of at the risk of stating the obvious, there is a lot of work to do in the rail industry on repairing relationships with employees. It can be hard work. It's challenging, but they've been making that work for 195 years now, and I have a lot of confidence that it'll be okay going forward.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Regan, we've heard for years that railroading is a well-paying job, but despite the good pay, the Class 1s are finding it harder to attract and retain workers. Can you please share with us some additional details about the low morale among freight rail workers and what are the leading causes of the morale issues?
Thank you for the question. I think we can go, the cause of all of the morale issues boil down to the reduction in the workforce levels. I think, and thank you for your introduction of the sick leave legislation this morning. But that also, I agree, I believe is a symptom of sort of the impact on individual workers of those drastic reductions in workforce. We have people who are required to be on call constantly that may not have access to their granted leave that was agreed to in the contract. We got rid of overboards, which are basically redundancy within the system that allow the railroad to continue to operate when people do need to take time off for whatever reason it may be. So, and then of course the attendance policies that were put in place to essentially discourage anyone from actually taking the leave that is available to them. These are all issues that contributed to the fight that we had last year where, let's be honest, despite the largest wage increase in 45 years that was agreed to in that Presidential Emergency Board and that was agreed to by the unions and the carriers, I think it goes to show you how bad the morale is when so many of the workers voted against that despite the economic benefits of that agreement.
Yeah, I was amazed by that. Thank you for your answer. As your testimony mentioned, paid sick leave is a top priority for your members. Can you please share more about railroad attendance policies that make it so important to guarantee and protect paid sick time?
Yes. So a lot of times what had been agreed to traditionally was a bank of personal leave days that could be used for any number of purposes. During the pandemic, when people were expected to go to work, again, in a public health emergency, and they were not able to get access to those leave days, it really put a premium on the sick leave policy and why that is so important moving forward. And I think the idea that we should have Congress sort of establishing a bare minimum of what should be expected for this vital workforce, a workforce that is so critical to our economy, is an important step that should be taken. I do appreciate the efforts that have been taken so far by the Class 1s to negotiate proactively with my unions, and we have a number of agreements that are in place. But I do think that this is something that the federal government is rightfully interested in when it comes to making sure these workers are safe and able to do their job effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. As I stated in my testimony, we members have sick days. Our staffs have sick days. Gentlemen have sick days. What is it about this workforce that they shouldn't be allowed to benefit what most Americans in the workforce do? Just kind of baffling to me. Mr. Jeffries, could you please direct your attention to the video screen? What we're seeing here is footage from a recent ProPublica investigation. Children have to crawl underneath parked freight trains just to get to school. Mr. Jeffries, simple yes or no question. Are images like these or the stories of the grandfather and the baby unable to get emergency care necessary for freight rail to function? Yes or no?
I'm sorry?
Are images like these or the stories of the grandfather and the baby that died unable to get emergency care necessary for freight rail to run to function?
Absolutely not. Those are unacceptable images.
Well, as it's been stated, this is quite a problem across the country. And, it is our obligation to try to have you and your colleagues visualize what we're talking about. I know we've been talking about rail crossings being blocked, and it seems people kind of get it, but nothing changes. So we figured we'd give a visual. The word that best comes to me after looking at these images, after worry, is arrogance. Freight railroads think that there won't be any consequences for blocking towns for hours or for offering increasingly poor service to their customers. It is past time for some accountability. But it looks like I won't have time to ask my question, so I will yield back. But I think we all need to keep this image in our minds as we have these discussions, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. And early in my testimony, I talked about the IIJA in my opening statement about the railroad crossing elimination program, $500 million going to this. I don't think that's enough. I think if you look at some of this, the bill that the Senate come by, they're talking about $4 million for 10 states to look at some of the worst crossings. We don't need to spend that $4 million. States have identified where the problems are. We need to go out there and fix the problems, and I'm with you, and I'd like to work with you on that, Mr. Payne, but thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being before the subcommittee today. Supply chain issues are a big topic. Supply chain challenges were with us before the pandemic, but certainly magnified and of course, created a lot more disruption post-pandemic. North Carolina, we're a grain deficit state. We have a lot of animal agriculture. And I've heard more than once from some of my integrator friends who've had a difficult time getting the grain that they need in a timely manner. So, Mr. Jeffries, Mr. Baker, I'm just curious, if that's risen to your level and attention and things that can be done to help alleviate that. In North Carolina, you have about 2 days' worth of feed. So it really is a just-in-time situation, and of course these animals don't get fed. That creates other issues, and talk about a domino effect. And of course we see domino effects with these supply chain issues across the board, but it could get quite dire there. So I'm just curious if this is something that's been discussed and what remedies we have available to us.
Well, thank you for that, Congressman, and certainly the poultry industry is one, and livestock more generally is one that's of critical importance to North Carolina, and we want to make sure we're serving that and supporting that appropriately. Certainly, it is on my radar. It has been brought to my level and to the executives in your state of the railroads, and I know steps have been taken, adding more high-capacity hopper cars. We are seeing some quicker turn times, are seeing a higher import of corn into the state, but certainly it's something we need to stay in close contact on. To your point, couple days supply isn't very much, and so we need to make sure that pipeline's continuing to run strong. So we want to work with you on that.
How much of the issue is lack of labor, or are there other key components to that are creating that problem?
So I can't speak to whether or not we're adequately sourced in that particular region, but hiring continues across the network. We're up over 10% year over year, but something that we want to keep working with you on to make sure we're addressing it.
Sure. Mr. Baker, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it would be fair to say that the problems in North Carolina and elsewhere are at our level literally every day. It's the dominant topic of conversation over the last few years. I think the entire industry is, frankly, probably a little embarrassed about bad service over the last few years. I do think that there's real green shoots looking forward, and it's starting to get better. As far as to what can be done to help without boring people and repeating my whole testimony, at least for short lines, for what Congress can do, the CRISI grant program is critically important. There's quite a few short lines in North Carolina that have used that program very successfully. And I'd also say regulation-wise, whether it's track inspection or broader rail safety regulation, it's important that regulation not be too burdensome and not harm our ability to serve customers.
Yeah. As some of you may know, Angie Craig, Colin Allred, myself, Dusty Johnson, we formed the Supply Chain Caucus, had an event a few weeks ago. Short line rail was part of the discussion there. For each one of you, is there a particular topic or particular focus you would like that supply chain caucus to have? If you had to pick one, I'll just go down the line. Mr. Jeffries?
Well, if I had to pick one, it would be permitting reform, which I know you are very focused on when it comes to both Clean Water Act issue, one federal decision issues, those things. I know you're a leader on legislation that was included in stuff moved by the House recently, so that's spot on.
Mr. Baker?
I think you identified employment as a huge challenge, and I think there's opportunities, whether it's REFACT, which we actually are in strong agreement with Mr. Regan on, or whether it's the ability to hire back retirees without them losing their railroad retirement benefits. There's quite a few policies that could help railroads hire people.
We
Mr.
support
Jan?
the call for permitting reform, but also would support the STB moving forward on reciprocal switching, as well as establishing minimum service delivery standards in the contracts we have with rail.
Say technology and innovation, particularly automation, which over the coming decades, it's going to dramatically reshape every mode of transportation.
I think you should rightfully be focused on freight rail in the supply chain as overall, and from my view, it's boosting workforce levels and improving the quality of life for workers.
Thank you much.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. I now recognize Mr. Moulton for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. You know, there's a lot of interest in rail safety right now because of some of the high-profile derailments. We don't need to belabor that point, but I think it is important to keep this in context. You know, to begin with, there's a lot of achievements that the railroads have made, which should be noted by the public and by this committee as we make policy and contemplate additional regulations. In 2021, there were 22,831 hazardous material incidents on highways compared to 391 freight railway hazmat incidents. Railroads have approximately 10% of the hazmat accident that trucks have, despite approximately equal tonnage. And from 2012 to 2022, so basically over the last decade, there have been 71 fatalities on the highways with hazmat, 0 on the railways. So I think it's really important as we contemplate regulations and think about what the second and third order effects are going to be of those regulations, that we keep in mind we want materials, including hazmat, to be carried by the railroads. Having said that, we don't want any accidents on the rails, and frankly, if you can make the case that you're improving safety, then that's all the more reason for shippers to choose rail, especially for these kinds of sensitive shipments. Now, in early March, I wrote a letter on rail safety recommendations to this committee, the Senate Commerce Committee, and Secretary Buttigieg. And I was pleased to see that the Senate Rail Safety Bill included provisions on defect detention and length of trains were 2 topics that were in my letter, although I think there's some work that could be done on the details of how those are implemented. Trains have gotten longer and longer in the last decade, increasing roughly 25% since 2008 on average. Some of the longest trains have gotten particularly long. And one of the things that we learned in doing research on this issue is that in the past, many railroads followed an informal operating practice of limiting the length of a train carrying hazardous materials to about 100 cars or fewer. We haven't found any evidence that this was sort of put on the books, but we've talked to numerous railroad officials who said that this was common operating practice. And the reason is just basic physics. Longer trains experience greater forces on their cars, making them more likely to derail and making the derailments more disastrous if they occur. So one of the things we want to investigate is whether or not we should regulate train length when it comes to hazardous materials. Obviously, when a car derails, the cars behind it are connected. And I was wondering if, Mr. Jeffries, you could speak to, the basic physics here. Why derailments of longer trains are harder to contain and tend to be more disastrous than having shorter derailments with shorter trains.
Well, I can make a couple comments. One, median train length right now is about 5,700 feet. About 90% of trains that start every day are under 10,000 feet. I know there was a reference to 5-mile-long trains. I'm not familiar with any 5-mile-long trains, but
No,
not saying
nor
there
am I.
aren't any.
Well, what about for trains that include hazmat, though? Do you know what the average length of trains that include hazmat is?
So I'll say our longest trains are typically intermodal and auto trains. Average merchandise train, so that's mixed merchandise. That's probably more towards the 7,500 to 10,000 feet. I'll say, 35% of our traffic used to be coal cars, 50
Right.
feet long, intermodal cars, 150 feet long. So, 100-car coal train's a lot shorter than a 100-car intermodal train. But I'm just observing there. But I know the National Academy of Sciences is doing a train length study as a requirement of the IAJA. Very engaged with the railroads, with other stakeholders, and they'll make recommendations on their views coming out of that, and certainly we're attuned to that, and I know the FRA is following the NAS lead there.
I mean, it's interesting when you say that you bring up 5,400 feet. I mean, what we've been advocating for in our proposal here is capping the length of trains carrying hazmat to 7,500 feet. So 1.42 miles, which is significantly longer. It makes me think maybe that might be too long. But how difficult would it be for the railroads to comply with a regulation like this?
Well, we want to make sure regulations are going to be data-driven and result in a demonstrable safety benefit. And so I'd be happy to continue the conversation or work with you on this. I can't say what, if there is a right length and what that is, but I can say we're wide open to following the data, and that is something NAS is looking at. If there is some sort of safety conduit to a certain length, we have not seen it in our operations. When you look at our mainline derailments, while they are the best they've ever been, to your opening point, derailments still happen, so that's too frequent. So we need to be looking at ways to drive that number down. Wayside detection is a big way of doing that, something we're doing voluntarily. I know we get criticized for doing it because there aren't regulations, but we are voluntarily doing things for safety. But it's something we should keep working on together, I would ask, and let the data drive us to the right outcome, and whether that's some sort of impact on train links, I'd let the data play that out. It's not what we're seeing, but I don't want to put the cart before the horse and end up with unintended consequences that gum up the network.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. We are also very interested in following the data here, so thank you, Mr. Jeffries, very much.
Thank you, Ms. Moulton. I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Stallber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Baker, you both mentioned in your testimony that permitting delays can unduly inhibit the expansion and development of rail facilities that could help in supply chains. Mr. Jeffries, first, can you describe in more detail and perhaps give us an example of the permitting delays that are holding the rail industry back?
Sure. So as you've probably heard me say before, we're proud of the fact that we're almost entirely privately owned, maintained. We do most of our own investment. We do certainly take advantage of some multimodal programs. But what we run into, we do have challenges on the local and state levels, which we deal with accordingly. But even with the good work that's been done at the federal level, whether it's one federal decision, for example, that only applies to DOT-sponsored projects. We do a lot of work with the Army Corps. We do a lot of work with the Coast Guard. And so those are still stuck in the old process where it's just a kind of a never-ending, no-shot clock situation. Local decisions when it comes to Clean Water Act decisions, again, what we're looking for is just certainty and timelines and sensibility when it comes to putting our dollars to work, because a key part of the supply chain is making the investments necessary to keep goods moving. And so we know that's an interest. Of course, it has to be balanced against sensible environmental reviews. We just want them to be predictable, and so we know what we're dealing with.
Mr. Baker, same question.
Short lines don't do a lot of big, massive terminal projects, but nonetheless, we find ourselves with permitting problems all of the time.
Give us a couple examples.
Even on small CRISI projects, which might be a $10 million track upgrade over 8 miles, just to get something that's called a FONSI, the finding of no significant impact. That can be months and months, sometimes years of delay. And then, of course, because we move the whole economy, we're not just interested in our own permitting problems. If our energy and manufacturing customers have problems building giant new facilities, that's a huge problem, obviously for short lines, but for the entire economy. So we strongly support all sorts of permitting reform. One federal decision's a great example. Section 106 historical preservation is a big challenge also. I think there's a lot of room there for Congress to make improvements.
So both of you testified you need permitting reforms. So do both of you support H.R. 1?
I certainly support the permitting efforts in there.
Mr. Baker?
I agree with that. I can't speak to the entire piece of
Because
legislation.
that permitting is, and you had mentioned, Mr. Jeffries, you had mentioned certainty and timeliness. That's exactly what it does. Exactly what it does. And that's going to help with the supply chain. And, you look at the opportunity to help with the supply chain, the permitting, the timeliness and certainty. That's what all industries have asked. And that's exactly what H.R. 1 does. And so, I look forward to having your industry and your folks work on our senators from on the other side of the House, so to speak, to get that across the finish line, to get it passed, 60 votes in the Senate, and then it may have to come back to conference, but it's a good piece of legislation. In fact, probably the best piece of permitting legislation in a generation that would forward our economy and certainly forward your endeavors as well. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. I would now recognize Ms. Foshee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. The topic of today's hearing is exploring rail supply chain resilience, and I don't believe that we can truly discuss this issue without first addressing our rail workforce. Railroad jobs are challenging. Employees are outside in all kinds of weather, on call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, on uneven surfaces and lifting heavy items. We know that railroads have been cutting staff starting before the pandemic and doubling down during the pandemic. Since 2015, railroads have cut nearly 1/3 of their workforce. Mr. Regan, you noted earlier that the lack of sufficient employees has led to strict attendance policies and little flexibility on sick leave. Employees have been made to feel that they would lose their jobs if they took leave, even at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you could, please, Mr. Regan, could you share more of some of what the scheduling practices that freight workers have had to deal with?
Sure, thank you. And I do think that there are ways that we've seen some progress on scheduling recently. I think when you look at the attendance policy aspect, that was the one that was really got the greatest ire out of the members that I represent, where instead of taking the time off that you want or need or have earned, there's point values assigned to certain days. So for example, if you're at a high impact day, it could take away 1/3 of your bank, and that's for your entire year's worth of leave. And if you go underneath that bank, you're gonna get disciplined. And those high impact days, by the way, were not days with necessarily more freight. They were things like Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas Eve, Super Bowl Sunday. So in other words, high impact for your family days. And that's designed to keep people working even when there maybe impersonal things happening in their lives. That wasn't the case when there was a workforce that was ample enough to be able to allow for people to take the time they needed when they wanted, and there were still going to be people there to do the work for them.
Are these practices leading some workers to leave the industry? And can you discuss some of the other reasons that we're seeing mid-career employees leaving the rail industry?
Yes, we are seeing an alarming number of people leave the industry, and this is a industry where, I know a lot of people that are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation railroad workers. They're proud to be railroad workers. We want to see this industry grow. But at a certain point, that cost benefit of a good wage and benefits was outweighed by the demands on their quality of life, their work-life balance, and people are saying it's not worth it anymore. I'm going to go work in another industry. And that has become really alarming for us because it used to be one that people, when you got that job, you were going to stick with it. You have good retirement, you got good benefits, and at this point, we're seeing a trend away from what has traditionally been a very stable workforce.
Thank you for that response. Mr. John, turning to you. The 4th District of North Carolina has over 800 chemistry jobs, so it is imperative to my district that you all have the resources necessary to succeed. Can you discuss the economic cost of your companies for rail service delivery problems?
Absolutely, and I appreciate that question. So, as I had said in my written testimony, the economic cost is the opportunity cost of lost manufacturing jobs here in this country. So, for example, we have a member that in the first quarter of this year lost 30 shipments, business that we would like to give to the railroads. We would like to do more with the railroads. These are manufacturing jobs and manufacturing opportunities that if we do not produce here, it does not happen, and we bring that in from overseas, most often from China, which is the dominant player on the global level. So this has a significant impact not only for the economy and jobs. In the United States, we employ in our industry alone over 500,000 people. As on behalf of the Rail Shipper Coalition, we employ 7 million people all across the country who rely on rail. And again, we would like to be giving more business to the railroads so we can produce more in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Just to let the panel know that we will most likely have votes here in the next few minutes. So before I call my next witness, we'll have votes at that point in time. We'll have to recess temporarily. I'm thinking maybe for about an hour. We've got 5 votes, very important votes, and then we will come back. So don't go too far. But I will now introduce Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Sorry, back and forth between committees here, but let me go with Mr. Baker. And your testimony earlier on said most short line railroads are family-run businesses, which I knew one of those families in Northern California, and there's others that run that Sacramento Valley as well that we appreciate. So in the infrastructure world, trucking is also another mode that has a lot of mom and pop small businesses. Yesterday, we heard from an owner-operator, independent drivers, about how regulations can drive them right out of business. So how about as far as a railroad, especially on short line, what can you say about how the broad one-size-fits-all regs out of DC or our mighty state of California might hit you differently for short line than for maybe the bigger outfits?
Thank you for the question. I do remember the family you knew up there quite well, Jaylene Forbes. I've spent a lot of time on the Hill with her. She was one of my favorites.
Enjoyed a lot of time on that railroad too there. So.
You're right.
Yep.
We are obviously extraordinarily concerned about regulation that we simply can't afford and that doesn't fix an actual problem. It's not really on Congress's plate at the moment, but since you brought it up, the CARB locomotive regulation is, in my 19-year career, it's the most stunning piece of regulation I've ever looked at. It for one of the things it does, starting in 2030, it simply says no locomotive older than 23 years old can be used in California, period. I have short lines that only have locomotives that are older than about 40 years old. I mean, and they write in their own regulation, some short lines might not be able to comply and might go out of business. And, they don't actually include the shrug emoji, but that's essentially the point. I thought it was really wild.
Yeah, I agreed. A bunch of my tractors, combines, I just had to buy another truck here recently to have something that was 2011 or newer, so I'd have at least 2 trucks to cover the amount of miles, which isn't a lot for what my farming operation needs. I have a beautiful 2003 model Peter built, the square nose, nice red fenders, all that. I can't use that but 1,000 miles per year, and just to run, maybe 7,000 miles at most. It's completely unreasonable. I hear what you're dealing with. So is there federal regs that are holding you back on efficiency or things that are maybe you're not being able to take advantage of technology because there's a federal intervention that's stopping that?
At the federal level, the biggest regulation that there's a whole set of them in the Senate rail safety bill that we are worried are too prescriptive and burdensome, but there's also an existing regulation in the works at the FRA mandating two-person crews on trains, and that sweeps up hundreds of short line railroads in that today have one person in the cab and then largely a second person on the ground, generally in a following pickup truck, which short lines find to be a more efficient and safer way to do it and better service for our customers.
You might like to see a carve out for short lines in their route for that one-on-one deal instead of two in the cab.
That would make sense to us.
Yeah, okay. And you did touch on the California situation. I mean, I just unbelievable to me that we think we're going to electrify everything and do it economically. And I remind everybody, a previous panel, I asked them how much the atmosphere is CO2, and nobody was even close. It's 0.04%. So we're going to all be moved into caves to eat crickets and berries in the dark because CO2 has moved from 0.03 to 0.04% since 1960, okay? And I'm not popular making this assertion a lot, but I'm going to keep making it. So, these regulations coming down the pike are not even realistic as they pull hydroelectric dams out of my district, and we barely got our nuclear power plant for an additional only 5 more years in California, which is 9% of our California grid. We're going to run out of electricity. And the people that love to put in new windmills and solar panels have a different group of people that sues to stop you from building the array, okay? It's ridiculous. So I don't see how they're going to reach it. I don't see how you get the efficiency. So, I'm going to run out of time here. But one thing, we don't got to bag on the truckers, They got their piece, all right? They're not zombies. If they need to raise their weight limit on there because they have to now run electric trucks, which would weigh 8,000 to 10,000. So we all got to work together because they're after all of us, okay? They're after the trucks, the trains, the ships, the planes, with all this ridiculousness. So let's all work together. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, sir. I now recognize Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Reagan, for over 3 decades, I have heard from railroad workers, railroad customers on the shortage of railroad workers having a negative impact on railroad efficiency, on-time scheduling, safety and fatigue of current workers being overworked. What is the current status of the railroad workforce? Have these issues been resolved? Are there enough workers and trainees in the pipeline? And how about women?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. The current state is not really much improved than it was last year when there was the threat of a work stoppage. I think there are some improvements being made. I think that we will start to see some quality of life improvements in the railroads, but I do think that at its core, we need to start hiring with a much greater frequency, and that's not only that, but retain workers. So, the net gain of workers on the railroads has really not increased much because we are seeing so many people leave the industry, and many of them are mid-career. It's not retirements, and for us, again, that's an alarming trend.
So, a couple different points there. One, hiring efforts continue. We've increased workforce by over 10% in just the last year. And two, I think we all recognize that railroading is a very challenging job. That's why it's compensated at the level it is. But it's not all about, and my colleague and friend Greg has made this point, it's not all about the money. And that's why it's important that we've made progress on creating a more scheduled work environment for some of our employees. And those agreements are starting to happen. On the sick leave front, every single Class 1 railroad now has a sick leave agreement in place with the majority of the unions that it operates. Not all of them. I'm counting, 37 different agreements so far. And so there's progress being made on that front, and that's being done through local bargaining, just as we committed to doing so at the end of the round last year. And so I just want to make clear that the committee understands that we're making progress on these issues. We're not there yet, got more work to do, but we're seeing results. And that's the important thing. And I think, quite frankly, that Greg and I could be working together a lot more to promote the benefits of this industry.
Why don't you?
Well, I'd love to, and I think we do in certain areas. For example, the REEF Act, we both work together, we're support, we come in fully bipartisan, and that's a good opportunity for expanded joint work.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. John, concerns from businesses in my district being charged demurrage fees due to circumstances outside their control, such as delayed pickups or deliveries from railroads. However, railcar owners do not have the ability to charge the same fees when railroads are slow to deliver or pick up. If you had the ability to add this fee to your service contract, would it improve your rail service?
We do believe that if we had those in minimum service delivery standards, that would address that. So you're right, that in terms of demurrage fees, unfortunately, have become a source of revenue for railroads rather than an incentive for our members to have their product ready to ship. And we're glad that the STB has stepped in to partially help address that. But we need more fundamental, broader reaching reforms to address this long term. For example, somebody mentioned the Staggers Act that passed in 1980. A lot has changed since then. Back in the day, the railroads owned all the rail cars. Now our members own, 3/4 of the rail cars are now owned by the shippers. And so this is a situation that is, it needs to go both ways. And so if the railroad is late, then we should have the ability to act in kind. And we think that that would clean up a lot of the problems that we're having right now. So we look forward to working with Congress and the STB to address this going forward.
Thank you for the answer. The last is just a statement for Mr. Payne. Ranking Member Payne, I want to associate myself with your earlier comments regarding long trains, which I've been working on for a long time, and the challenges our community face with block crossings. My constituents experience this challenge every day on their walk to school, drive to work, and local businesses trying to get to their goods to market. They wait too long at block crossings, which cause safety problems, congestion, and health risks. Thank you, Ranking Member Payne, for your continued work on this issue, and I yield back.
Ms. Napolitano yields. I now will call upon Mr. Kane. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Baker, I understand that the Chrissy Grant Program is essential to helping short-line railroads update their infrastructure, which I think ought to help with both sides of both the supply chain and any safety concerns at the same time. Is that correct? And can you elaborate how Chrissy is essential to short-line railroads?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Chrissy is a hugely successful grant program run out of the FRA. I think maybe unlike all federal spending, it seems to have widespread bipartisan and bicameral support. Short lines use it extensively to simply help us afford infrastructure investments that you otherwise couldn't justify on a short line. It helps us maintain service to small towns and rural America and kind of do what we do best to help serve our shippers. We very much appreciate your support, this committee's support, and I think there's more Congress could do too. I think could, again, simply increase the funding, but could also ask or direct the FRA to focus particularly on freight rail safety and freight rail supply chain. FRA has a lot of options with Chrissy, but we think a little more focus could be a huge improvement without spending any more pennies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jeffries, the main rail lines are critical for the ability to move products to market. This is especially true for construction material industries, whose products are needed to build infrastructure and to improve communities. Service disruptions and delays may hamper construction of critical projects. What is your industry doing to address these challenges and to work with industries to ensure that materials get to market on time so that we can build?
Well, first it starts with investment, making sure we have a network that's ready to move goods and keep that volume moving timely. Second, equally as important, adequately sourced workforce. Hiring efforts continue. I don't think there's any secret, and I won't shy behind the fact that we got caught short coming out of the depths of the pandemic, calling them furloughed employees back. We've been digging out from that. A lot of progress has been made, more progress to go. But really, third is making sure that the regulatory structure that surrounds us encourages innovation, encourages use of technology, discourages unintended consequences that would unknowingly or knowingly provide more complexity, more touches, gum up the network, and increase friction in goods movement where it otherwise wouldn't occur.
Thank you. Mr. Regan, in your written testimony, you mentioned the issue of staffing. You talk about the need for conductors to have the ability to fix mechanical problems when a train breaks down. How can TTD partner with the freight carriers to attract workers?
Thank you, and I think this is a good follow-up to the point that the Congresswoman made earlier. I think there are a lot of ways where we can work with the freight railroads to actually deliver on better service and I think the responsible deployment of technology. We're not I think that there's this perception that we're opposed to technology. In fact, that's not true. Our workers want those tools to help them do their jobs. We want to actually deploy more automated track inspection technology, but not at the expense of their own jobs. We think that's an important tool that helps them do the job more effectively and more safely. They both have different things they offer to track inspections. There's a way that we can do it together. Then I think that there is a really important pathway forward that will improve service for everybody.
In your testimony, you mentioned that the nation's freight rail system is fundamentally broken. And what are some of the specific recommendations that we can do together to restore a healthy freight rail system that will promote safety, innovation, and continue competitiveness with other transportation modes? What would you recommend?
I think we do, as I mentioned earlier, I think we do need to pass a rail safety legislation. The Senate made the first step this week over in Senate Commerce. I think we do need to see strong, standardized safety across all of the freight rail systems. That we're not relying on, happenstance, different models for different railroads and different technology uses in different areas. I think we do have to have a federal standard for that regard. And from economic regulation, we're dealing with, and I think my friends in the shipping community would tell you that there's real ambiguity about what does the common carrier obligation mean? It's in law, but what does it mean? And also, how do we make sure that the regulator, the Surface Transportation Board, has the tools it needs to actually enforce that definition? So I think those are two important policy areas where Congress can be very helpful here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Cohen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're looking at rail supply chain issues, and it's important to get the goods to market. They don't go by Federal Express. There's no better way to do it. Still can go through Memphis as well. The train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio in February, followed closely by another derailment and toxic spill in Raymond, Minnesota. Stark reminders of the importance of proper regulation and enforcement for railroad safety. Just this morning, there was another train derailment in Mason, Tennessee, right near Memphis. No reported injuries or hazardous material involved, but a train car in the water and damaged bridge to contend with. I support the important work that must be done to repair and support supply chains, but this work cannot come at the expense of health and safety of rail workers and vulnerable communities across the country. I voted for giving rail workers paid sick leave in December, and I'm proud to again support 7 days paid leave in the Freight Rail Workforce Health and Safety Act introduced today by ranking members Larson and Payne. If the U.S. guaranteed paid sick leave to all workers like every other industrialized nation, American rail workers wouldn't even have to be in this situation, but they are, and we were in the problem we were in last year, but we kind of got it done with the president. He's got us away from having a strike. We must correct this injustice. Rail workers doing essential work to keep our economy running should not be forced to choose between their health and a paycheck. The consequences of an understaffed and overworked rail industry will not just be carried by the workers, and this committee should be proactive in reducing the chances of accidents through work-centered solutions. Mr. Jeffries, your name was rather anodyne to me before yesterday, and yesterday I ran into Jerry Costello, and he had some very nice things to say about you. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but all of a sudden your name came up, and then I come here and I looked there and I went, wow, where did I see that name? And I thought it was Costello. In your written testimony, you mentioned the challenges that rail companies are currently facing in finding and keeping employees. You wrote that Class 1 railroads have announced agreements with many of their unions on ways to improve quality of life, such as more predictable work schedules and additional paid sick leave. Do you think that 7 days of paid sick leave for rail workers is a good industry standard?
Well, when the bargaining agreement was reached last fall and the sick leave discussion was left unresolved, at that time I said that sick leave matters were best left between railroads and their unions, and I was confident that the matter would be taken up locally between each railroad and their unions. I'm very pleased to announce that every Class 1 has reached a sick leave agreement with the majority of its unions, and those are not all a monolith. Different agreements have different shapes and sizes, but I'm pleased that we've followed through on that commitment. Related to that, there were provisions in the agreement that would require the operating crafts, the folks out on the rail line, to work with the railroads to develop a model that creates a more scheduled work environment. It's not unreasonable for an engineer to want to have a better understanding of when they're going to work, when they're going to be home. And I'm very pleased that while those are more complex negotiations, one of our railroads just announced an agreement with Smart TD just about a week ago that they had reached just such an agreement, and that should be a model moving forward. There's a lot of progress being made there. I'm sure folks would like to see it moving more quickly, but I'm personally very pleased and gratified that we're seeing this progress done in the bargaining process.
So most of the angst that we had last fall has been relieved, I presume, now. Everybody's kind of agreed to 7 days. Everybody's agreed to 7 days, all the railroads and their unions.
I don't know, in some way, shape, or form, everybody's gotten an agreement. So, you know, every union has at least an agreement with one Class 1 except one union, which there hasn't been any progress yet, but hopefully we'll get there.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Mr. Reagan, is it Reagan or Regan?
It's Regan.
Regan, I'm sorry. We've heard from freight railroads that are committed to growing their workforce. Norfolk Southern CEO said in a recent interview that his company is on a hiring spree. What are some of the ways railroads could improve their recruitment, training, and retention of workers?
Well, thank you for the question. I think the retainment is another key factor here because if you look at the actual active employment levels, they haven't increased the way that we would like to see. And I think, you know, Ian and I agree that we want to see the workforce growing. We want to see the industry growing. And so I think these local agreements that are being made are important steps to ensuring that when people get on the job, when they're hired on, that they're going to want to stick with it and make this their career. So I do applaud them for proactively reaching out to unions and trying to find agreements on these.
And this last union that hadn't agreed yet,
I know that they're talking. I would like to see an agreement there. I'd like to see some of their specific needs met by the railroads. Again, you know, I represent 13 different unions. And that's all different crafts and classes on the railroads, and they do different jobs and have different responsibilities. So I recognize that a lot of these things, when it comes to attendance or sick leave or other policies, are indeed best left to local bargaining so we can address the needs of that workforce. I think where there was a lot of frustration in the last national round was that those specific work-life balance complaints weren't being addressed at that level, and it's kind of forced all of those questions to the national bargaining so that when we should be talking about wages and benefits and economics on national bargaining, instead we had a lot of other stuff that was being thrown in there and actually made their negotiations quite difficult.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to, Mr. Burleson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Scribner, most industries are benefiting because of automation and finding ways to cut costs, improve efficiency, reduce time through automation. How could this possibly benefit the freight system, the rail system?
Well, thank you for the question. I think, you know, with railroads in the United States, I mean, it's different abroad because we have vertically integrated railroads that own the infrastructure and operate over those lines. It's not separate, and that's sort of the truck comparison that I made in my opening statement. They're not also covering infrastructure there, whereas in the U.S., the freight railroads are. That's infrastructure and operations over the infrastructure. So I think you can see benefits on both the infrastructure side, but also with automated track inspection, but also further in the future, automation of train operations as well. So automation technology can benefit inspection. ATI is one example, but the use of emerging aviation technologies, drones in bridge inspections and things like that, keeping people out of harm's way, reducing costs, all the benefits of automation that we see in other domains and other industries.
So do you see that if with the advent of automation, the advent of more things that are available, some of the proposals that are being suggested are requiring more people to be on the train? Is that counter to where technology is advancing?
Yeah, mandating a permanent labor floor is not a good way to encourage investment in automation or deployment of automation. It destroys the business case, or at least certainly substantially weakens it. So policies that would discourage it, they'll discourage automation, and that has broader competitive implication and the implications for the long-term health of the industry and perhaps the existence of the industry.
Yeah, whenever I ran for office, what I heard from the community was supply chain, supply chain. What are you going to do to fix the supply chain? Some of these proposals I'm hearing are, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that anything that we do that would actually make it more difficult to operate and move product is not going to benefit the supply chain.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, first, if we're talking about regulation, identify a market failure and then show that the remedy for that, the benefits outweigh the costs. We've seen many examples where that's not happening. And that's where I think we can go back in history and look at the pre-Staggers environment. And that was a story of decades and decades of well-meaning but counterproductive policy accumulating until we almost had the collapse of the industry in the 1970s. I hope we don't repeat that again.
That we don't go back to being overly regulatory and end up harming the industry. Thank you, Mr. Scribner. Mr. Jeffries, to that end, we're hearing a lot of proposals about where we are going to try to tell your industry how to be safer, what you ought to be doing. I've got to think, don't you already have your clients, the people you represent, don't they have an inherent desire to not have accidents?
Absolutely. There's no benefit to anybody to have a derailment. Right. And so any notion that railroads aren't laser focused on operating safely is completely off base. Yeah. And I know there's some chatter about a lack of regulatory overstructure of this industry. All I would say to that is ask your staff to get the Code of Federal Regulations for the rail industry, and it's about this tall. So there's ample opportunity there.
Yeah, you guys, if you have a derailment, you face litigation, right? Cleanup, just all of the costs is a punishment in and of itself, or an incentive to not have that happen.
Well, absolutely. And to be clear, when an incident does occur, a railroad's going to take full accountability, full responsibility for the cost of cleanup, et cetera. But the incentive is there to operate safely and to operate seamlessly and to be good partners. All the example you need, there's discussion about a need for regulations around our network of wayside detectors. Well, the only reason those are there is because of voluntary investment that's occurred over decades. We could have sat and not done anything. We're being criticized because there aren't regulations over wayside detectors now. But again, those were steps and those were significant investments that were made to make a safer railroad without waiting for a federal bureaucrat to tell us it needed to be done. And so absolutely, there's a laser focus and a top-line priority to run a safe railroad.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I've been notified there will be a series of votes occurring on the House floor, and the committee will stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
So who am I going to go first?
The Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure will reconvene the previously recessed hearing. I now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Titus for questioning.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me sit in on this hearing. I was on the Rail Subcommittee, so I have a real interest in this. Before I begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter this into the record. It's a story from Las Vegas CBS on the hazmat trains.
No objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries, when we were together last time, I think it was during the hearing last year, I expressed some concerns for the potential for environmental catastrophe over long trains. And in response, you said, I think when you look at train length versus incident, there has not been any correlation there. Almost 90% of trains operated any given day are under 7,500 feet long. Well, considering the length of the East Palestine train was 151 cars or 9,300 feet long, which is over that 7,500 threshold, have your opinions changed or attitudes changed or any evidence changed to that effect?
Well, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. When you look at mainline derailments, we're actually at an all-time low for 2022. And I know that the NTSB has indicated that train length was not a factor in that incident. That doesn't mean that there aren't other factors at play, and that's why the investigation's occurring. And while we're proud of our safety record, we still have accidents, and accidents can have major impacts on communities. And we've got to further improve because even one accident can have a devastating impact. And so we've got to learn, apply lessons learned, and continue to improve.
Okay, well, I appreciate that because, like you say, even one accident is too many. And if 10% of the trains are over that length, that could lead to potentially more accidents. So thank you for that. But speaking of accidents and environmental concerns and lack of transparency, I wanted to ask you about how you notify state and local governments if a train is carrying some considered hazardous material.
So there's really two different methods that we employ. One is a notification coordination with state fusion centers or the state security organizations that really gives a forecast of these are the types of products that are moving through your state. Here's who to contact. We also, at the responder level, have developed a mobile application that allows a first responder to put in a car number for a car on any train that will provide the entire consist of the train, if hazmat is on the train, if there is hazmat, how to respond to it and who to contact. And so we've taken a multi-pronged approach there, and we're always looking to maximize availability. We want to make sure first responders are prepared and have the information they need and the equipment they need. Because as rare as an incident is, they do occur, and we want to make sure folks are prepared to mitigate the impacts.
Well, thank you. The Fusion Center in Las Vegas is in my district. Those train lines go right down the strip, right behind the strip, right through the heart of town. But I hear from Las Vegas that maybe you're notifying the state, and they have a person at the Fusion Center, but they don't seem to be getting that information. How can we improve that?
Well, that's something that I would love to sit down and talk more with your office about because we want to make sure the right people are getting it. And while there are certain limitations, those involved in response, emergency response, and security, those are the right folks, and they need to have that information because they're going to be in the middle of any sort of response. So we want to make sure the right people have that, and if they're not getting it, let's work and make sure that's going to occur.
Thank you. One more question along those lines. Do you give that information to them if it's just one car, or does it have to have the 20 cars to qualify for the hazardous train status?
Well, on the real-time information, that's the consist and contents of any cars moving through. On the pre-notification, it is more of these are the types of products that move through, and here are the general volumes of such that are moving through. And I'd, again, be happy to sit down and make sure that the right folks in your state are getting that info because they need it. It's important if anything ever happens. We don't want it to, and we certainly work to make sure it doesn't, but if something did happen, we want to make sure that the right folks are ready and prepared.
I appreciate that, because like I said, it does go right through town. And I know this isn't directly related, and when you talk about transporting nuclear waste, a whole bunch of other agencies are engaged in that. But I have concerns about this because, you know, we've been fighting Yucca Mountain for decades, and it's never over till it's over. And that, if that should be transported by rail as well as by truck, that's going right through Las Vegas, right through the heart of District 1, and we just want to be sure everything's being done to keep that transport as safe as possible, whatever kind of hazardous material.
100% agree with you on that, and rail is by far the safest way to move that, and so we want to maximize all safety precautions regarding things along those lines. 100% agree.
Well, let's work together on that to be sure our folks are notified. Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Ms. Titus Yields, I now recognize Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony today. I know that some of this has been covered, and I want to just return to a couple items. I come from a part of New York where rail has been significantly important to the conversation Mr. Jeffries was having. Would say that our emergency responders coordinate response pretty well, and the communication is good. Certainly always opportunity to build on that, but in particular, in my corner of New York, short line railroads are really vital and have a very significant presence. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you speak a little bit about the cause of short line derailments having more to do with bad, worn out, or insufficient infrastructure tracks in particular. I know that we've discussed the Chrissy Grant program. I want to just return there. I certainly support making investments in our infrastructure and understanding the importance of strengthening our supply chain, and that's one of the reasons I join others in prioritizing appropriations requests for the full funding of the Chrissy Grant program to improve rail safety and infrastructure. Mr. Baker, can you just speak a bit more with some detail about how the short line rail industry utilizes these particular grants?
Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. One of the interesting things with short lines and class ones, short lines have plenty of derailments, far more than we would like, and actually at a slightly higher rate than the class ones, but they tend to be very different. They have different causes. Typically, we run our trains much slower, so there's also sort of, you know, they tend to make the news less. But as you noted, the cause tends to be track, right? And it's basically because it's extraordinarily expensive to maintain and upgrade rail track, and short lines don't have enough money all the time. And so the Chrissy Grant program has been extraordinarily useful in doing that. And a lot of what we do with Chrissy is very basic blocking and tackling, kind of rail 101, right? Upgrade the ties, upgrade the track, invest in the track, inspect it, invest in it. Chrissy helps us do that with bridges too. And we've used that to great effect in New York. And we are really excited for the first round of Chrissy grants that are going to be funded by the new infrastructure bill come out in a few months, and very much appreciate your support on Chrissy going forward.
Well, I appreciate that, and certainly the folks in particular Binghamton and Broome County, New York, are particularly interested in that ongoing investment. We look forward to partnering. Yesterday, the rail workers' unemployment and sickness benefits were cut. I'm a co-sponsor of the REEF Act, which will protect rail employees and mandated cuts to benefits. Benefits, of course, we all understand, deter employees. Benefit cuts deter employees to continue work and seek out work in the first place. So we want to confront, obviously, the workforce issues. The bill, the REEF Act, will improve workforce and supply chain constraints. The best part of these benefits is that these benefits are funded solely by the railroads, so it doesn't cost taxpayers, which we like, of course. Mr. Regan, I'm glad to see you again, and I would love you just to speak a little bit about the value of the REEF Act and be as specific as you like.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your support of this legislation. In my view, this should be a common sense bipartisan win to make sure that workers who have paid into this program, that it does not receive any federal subsidies, it does not come out of the general fund, it has been unfairly subjected to sequester, and we temporarily got relief from that during the national health emergency, but now these people are having their benefits reduced by nearly 6%. This has the support not only of the unions, but also of the railroads, both short lines and class ones. This is a win to give people their earned benefits, and we hope that this Congress will pass it as soon as possible.
Well, universal support around here generally leads to continued delays, so we're hopeful that, Mr. Jeffries, if you like, go ahead.
Sure, I just want to reiterate everything my colleague said and be on the record saying railroads both, I'll speak for Chuck, well, short lines, Class 1, support the effort as well. It's something that we all think makes sense and look forward to getting it done.
Well, we certainly do as well, and if anything, during the pandemic, what we said when we compelled the president to roll back those emergency orders was, frankly, what we should have been doing is identifying what worked during the pandemic and what didn't, never return to that which didn't work, but those things that did, we ought to consider enacting as either law or policy. So thank you very much. Look forward to working with all of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now 5 minutes for Mr. Van Orden from the great state of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it greatly. Hey, just some general comments about rail. It's one of the key components of intermodal movement of goods, and I understand that perfectly. I live in a town called Prairie du Chien. It's along the Mississippi River. If you do not like trains, you don't live there. We've got probably 60 trains going through every day. You're well aware that we recently had a derailment for the BNSF Railroad a little further north, about 45 minutes up from where I live. We immediately coordinated with the BNSF Railroad, FEMA, NTSB, the FRA, our local county officials, Crawford County officials, Congressman Ashley Hansen from across the river, but more importantly with Chairman Nels. And I really appreciate your support. And he also made several members of his staff available to us. Here's part of the issue. Leading up to this derailment, we had record flooding on the Mississippi River. I called the BNSF Railroad and told them that I was distinctly uncomfortable with the conditions of the tract. BNSF Railroad told me in a rather condescending manner that, don't worry, Congressman, we've been working on these railroads for over 100 years. Everything is fine. 6 days later, there was a railroad car floating down the Mississippi River containing paint towards a dam. If that dam had been collapsed, or if it had been damaged and it collapsed, that could lead to a catastrophic cascading failure of the locks and dams along the Mississippi River. So needless to say, I was uncomfortable with their approach to this. One of the immediate things that I want to tell you about, Mr. Jeffries, is that I understand that you have Ask Rail, and I think that that's a fantastic long-term digital solution. I'd like you to think about using a short-term analog solution, because one of the problems was when our guys on the ground, these train cars are ripped apart. They don't have Ask Rail, or they had Ask Rail, but they didn't quite know how to use it yet because they weren't fully trained, and they couldn't tell what was in the carts because the placards, I don't think, are spaced enough on the side. So if you only have 4 placards per car, or whatever the minimum requirement is, if you just doubled those placards, it would have granted a lot of relief to our emergency workers on the ground. So if you could maybe take a note of that, that would be great. So one of my concerns is this, is that the general public is losing confidence in the railroad, and I think that that's a terrible thing to do, because if the railroad stops, the country stops, and that's just clear. If our trucks stop, the country stops also. And I think part of the problem is that we're not able to turn around these investigations fast enough, and there's several different government agencies that should be able to message this better. I understand, I've read all of your detailed testimony from everybody on the panel. I appreciate it greatly, and I know that the rail safety is actually increasing, but the public confidence in the rail is decreasing at a reciprocal rate. So well, I think one of the things is, and I spoke to NTSB again yesterday, and I'm going to introduce some legislation to increase the amount of rail inspectors that we have. And Mr. Chairman, I would like your support on this.
Certainly.
Okay, so we'll be introducing some legislation to increase our rail inspectors to make sure that we can turn around these investigations faster, and that we can do some better messaging both from Congress and then from the private industries and also the government agencies. And I just want to know, is that something that you would support?
I think the sooner we can get the results of investigations, the better. And if this helps, which it sounds like it would, turn investigations around more quickly, absolutely.
And then do you have confidence in these private companies to conduct the types of inspections, even when they have some external stimulus from maybe, I don't know, like a member of Congress who lives right next to the railroad tracks and whose grandchildren are 3 blocks away from that? Do you have confidence that maybe in the future these folks will start listening to outside sources?
Well, I think it's in railroad's best interest to operate as safely as possible, and that we're taking steps every day to do that. And if an incident occurs, we've got to take lessons learned from that incident and apply them so it doesn't happen again.
Okay, well, your industry across the board. And I know Mr. Reagan and I have talked to each other before, that you're probably not related to Ronald Reagan, let's just say that, but you guys have my support. And so if there's anything we can do from my office, please reach out. With that, I yield back, sir.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? I see none. Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. Listen, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I know that we had to take that break. I appreciate your patience, but I believe that this is a step in the right direction. I thought this was a very fruitful, beneficial hearing, and hopefully we'll have another one one day again soon. With that, we're adjourned.